if you really want to go deeper, if you really want to cut through the deeper layers of obscurations, cut into the truth, and really attain fundamental liberation, you really have to go beyond mindfulness. But the kind of trajectory I use in this book is a classic notion of transcend but include, which means all the post-mindfulness practices that I do introduce, they're based on the platform of mindfulness.
Welcome. You are listening to Our Mindful Nature, formerly titled The Mindful Minute. I'm your host, Meryl Arnett. This podcast explores the deep connection between land and self through nature-based meditations and meditative experiences that invite us back into belonging to each other, to our ancestors, to the earth, and to all beings that make up this universe. If you would like to access these meditation practices as standalone audio files, please subscribe to my newsletter at merylarnett.com. It's free, and you'll receive a new mini meditation each week, along with behind-the-scenes content and bonus material for each podcast episode. All right, grab a cup of tea, pop in your headphones, and find a comfy seat. Let's settle in for today's episode. Andrew, I am delighted to get to chat with you again. I think it's been just about a year, actually, since we talked last time. Thank you for coming back and chatting again.
Yeah, no, it's my delight. I so appreciate the time and the effort for you to look at my material and the opportunity to talk about it. Thank you.
Absolutely. So listeners, I just finished reading Andrew's newest book, Mindful, Now What? Moving Beyond Mindfulness to Meet the Modern World. You know, and I just want to start and say that I felt when I read this book like it was speaking to questions both that I have experienced in my own practice in this moment that we are living in, as well as questions that I get all the time from students and listeners. It just feels so timely. So thank you for that.
Welcome. Thank you for sharing that. That's great.
And I would love, you start the book off just by sort of dropping into the introduction that you did this really interesting 5-year retreat, a structure of which I had never heard of. I was very familiar with like a 3-year monastic retreat. What you did sounds a little different. And maybe you could just share a little bit about what that was.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was really one of the great, not the great experience of my life. And so, like you suggested, the traditional 3-year, mostly Tibetan Buddhist retreat is a block concerted 3 years, 3 months, 3 weeks, 3 days kind of thing. But my teacher, Trungpa Rinpoche, had, I think, a pretty brilliant idea that the opportunity to work in a more kind of integrated fashion, in other words, mixing meditation with one's life, because otherwise, meditation, the near enemy of these sorts of practices is, of course, are types of spiritual bypassing, meditative escapism, and things like that. And so, just like you said, we were like 1 year in, 1 year out, 1 year in, 1 year out. And so it really was like a 5-year meditation. And it was fantastic for a number of reasons, in addition to what I just said. One is that sometimes people don't realize that when you do this type of retreat, it's not like you're just doing one practice. In fact, that's one reason I'm inspired to write this book. You do a host of practices. It's like meditation university. It's just so many different practices. And even over the course of 3 concerted years in retreat, that's not enough time to really digest, metabolize, incorporate this material. So having a year off helps you to work with, digest, metabolize what you've been given. Also helps you prepare for the upcoming year, and creates opportunity to mix meditation with post-meditation, which is the whole bloody point, right? Because otherwise it just becomes this feel-good strategy or the escapist thing. And so I really appreciated this approach. It was challenging as all get out, because you'd have to come back, get your life back together, go back in. It's like the whole thing falls apart again. You come back out. So it's a wonderful, quote unquote, painful opportunity to practice with the dying and rebirth, if you like.
I think that is so powerful. And it's, I could see Because we all have this little moment where we sit on our meditation cushion or our couch or wherever it is that we do our 10, 20-minute practice. And then you get up and your day begins. And we're asked to sort of carry the practice forward
Right.
into the day. So I can just visualize that practice over the course of
Oh
5 years. That's really
yeah,
cool.
yeah, totally. And at the end of the year, the third year, we were introduced to a set of practices that were very specifically designed to kind of enter lifetime retreat in the course
Mm,
of your normal life. And so that was really like the icing on the cake that has really just propelled me ever since.
wow. And so this book is weaving some of these other practices, these deeper contemplative practices, um, into, on top of, alongside mindfulness, which is what
Mhm.
so many of us are very familiar with. And I just love this statement you made earlier on. So I'm going to read it in the book. If calming down is your goal, you can stop with mindfulness. But if you want to wake up and grow, you'll need to grow beyond mere tranquility. Love
Yeah, boy,
it.
you pinged it. That's so important. My languaging, mindfulness sedates. It doesn't liberate. Now, this doesn't in any way criticize the extraordinary power of mindfulness and the mindfulness revolution. It's amazing. It's just such a remarkable contribution. But if you really want to go deeper, if you really want to cut through the deeper layers of obscurations, cut into the truth, and really attain fundamental liberation, you really have to go beyond mindfulness. But the kind of trajectory I use in this book is a classic notion of transcend but include, which means all the post-mindfulness practices that I do introduce, they're based on the platform of mindfulness. So they include it as a platform while simultaneously transcending it. And that's important
Mm.
because, yeah, we have these kind of classifications or silos of the mind, all these different types of practices that describe different dimensions of the mind. But on one level, it all gets pretty fuzzy. You can't just say, "Oh, this is the mindfulness department of your mind. This is the insight department. This is the metta or compassion department." And they're obviously deeply intertwined and interconnected. So we tease these apart. The tradition teases these practices apart to cultivate different aspects of the mind and heart, um, um, basically for pedagogical or heuristic purposes, for teaching purposes. But then eventually, when you leave the cushion and into your life, they all kind of cross-pollinate and feed on each other and eventually bootstrap each other. That's kind of the point.
Yeah. And so I wish we had 2 hours and I could ask you about every single practice in the book. And I'm going to pick and choose since we're not
Okay.
going to talk for 2 hours. But maybe let's just do a brief introduction for those that aren't familiar with Shamatha and Vipassana, because those are the two that you sort of bring in right after mindfulness. So let's give people like a little trajectory of what do we mean when you bring in a word like Shamatha? What do you mean when you bring in
Yeah,
Vipassana? Yeah, let's start there.
sure. Okay. Okay. Well, the relationship between shamatha, which is the Sanskrit word, the Tibetan is shine, tranquility, quiescence, it's really almost synonymous with mindfulness. You can centrifuge out the 9 stages of shamatha practice to say exactly that mindfulness is kind of really cultivated in the fourth stage. And if we want to get that nerdy and academic, sure, we can go that way. But I think for the purposes of time, the biggest one to work with is the relationship of Vipassana, that's Sanskrit, Vipassana, that's Pali, in its relationship to mindfulness practice, because that's really the colossal contribution. That's also, this term, just like with mindfulness, shamatha, I'm sorry, Vipassana slash insight meditation it's a multivalent term, which means it's one word that applies to a host of different practices. So on one level, you have the insight Vipassana practices that are associated very specifically with what's called Theravadan Buddhism, which is where you're working with a contemplative experience, a particular quality of experience arises and you label it. You're specifically saying, okay, anger, passion. That's a type of insight meditation that's extraordinarily valuable. But insight also slash Vipassana also relates to, excuse me, the analytic meditations. These are practices where you investigate the nature of these emotions, you investigate the nature of the mind, the nature of reality. And so these, excuse me, the Vipassana meditations go really, really deep. And then just parenthetically, I have a whole chapter in the book on the 5 nocturnal meditations, which are all centered around dream yoga. And dream yoga is basically nighttime Vipassana. It's using the nocturnal mind to investigate, to look and inquire into the nature of that mind. And so Vipassana is a big deal practice. It's really, this, by the way, is what the Buddha contributed. He did not come up with mindfulness. He inherited that from the developing Brahmanical tradition. So the Buddha's contribution was not mindfulness. That was already there. His contribution, or you could say more, articulation or emphasis, was in fact on Vipassana, on insight. And because what he did was he took the developing Hindu Brahmanical practices, brought them to their fruition, and really said, kind of close but no cigar. In other words, it just delivered him to the penthouse of samsara. And samsara is a term that's used in contradistinction to nirvana. It's basically just a conventional conditioned world of existence. And so this is important. Again, it's like this notion that even the highest domains of shamatha, mindfulness, lead to metaphysical valium, right? Where you're just really chilled out. Hey, and when a world's on fire, chilling out is a really good thing. I'm not dissing it at all. But if you want to go further and you want to attain so-called salvation, liberation, then Vipassana is absolutely mandatory.
Yeah, and I find that the conversation I sort of continue to have in my regular classes is like, this was great. I feel really good in this class, but then I get in my car and I turn the radio on and I hear about the latest crisis and I'm dealing with whatever, and it's very easy to get pulled out of that state of chill.
Isn't it? It's
very easy.
So true. Yeah, that's so true. That's exactly spot on. So you go in there, you chill out, you kind of pacify again. It's like settling the waves, balancing the winds and all that. But then the Vipassana practices are like, well, why did the waves come up in the first place? Why did the winds arise in the first place? And so you can continue to play a little whack-a-mole, mixing as many metaphors as I can, right? You play whack-a-mole and kind of bring about this level of equanimity through that method. But Vipassana is like, well, why are these moles coming up to begin with? That's the great liberation. So this is where the analysis comes in, the investigations. And also, just to toss in briefly, these are not just purely cerebral, cognitive, so-called intellectual investigations. These are equally investigations of the body and of the heart. So that's where the real liberation comes from, because we're not really fundamentally changed when you think about it, when we just think about things or we're working at a kind of cognitive cerebral level. We're changed when we feel things. And so that's a big part of the book, is how mindfulness can sometimes flip into a more kind of mental gymnastics, this negative aspect of waking up. I riff a lot in this book about the importance of waking down into the wisdom of the body, and that the type of insight and true liberation that comes from that kind of descent into the nature of who we are.
And I think you speak very honestly about that process is not necessarily a process of I'm happy and peaceful every moment of every day. And in fact, it can feel quite chaotic, and perhaps there's support we need to bring in. I would love to bring that into this conversation.
That's another really big one. Yeah. The radical teacher Trungpa Rinpoche has a great line here where he says, mindfulness or meditation, I should say, meditation isn't a sedative, it's a laxative. And that's really important to understand. And this is why I wrote my very first book 15 years ago, Power and the Pain, after coming out of my 5-year retreat. Because when I was in there, it was a crap show. All this stuff broke loose and came up, and it was like, boy, nobody told me it was going to be this hard, and my body fell apart and everything fell apart. Humpty Dumpty / the ego just really went splat. And then the issue was, well, what do you do with that? And how do you relate to that? So this is where, and I write about this in the book, the augmenting, supporting approaches of body work, psychology, psychotherapy, working with that dimension. Because for me, Meryl, the whole thing, again, somewhat like we were talking about earlier in terms of the gradations and the spectrum of working with mind and heart, it's a psycho-spiritual journey that if we put everything in the meditative spiritual basket, well, that leads into a host of its own enemies, like I alluded to earlier, what John Welwood calls, meditative spiritual bypassing. So for
Mm.
me, the book is really largely integral in spirit. It's about joining East and West, the North and South, science and spirituality, just basically working with a number of different vectors from different world wisdom traditions, both East and West, to bring a more kind of broad spectrum approach to the journey of waking up, which again is sometimes waking down. And also, if you're going to do it genuinely, you're going to have to deal with your unconscious mind, which really is your body. And so there's a bunch of stuff stuffed into your unconscious mind, and that's going to come up. And so if you don't know how to relate to it, that can be somewhat challenging and problematic. So I throw then into the book, I throw in some tips, suggestions for how to engage the psychotherapeutic approach. I mean, I have personally in my own life, I have zero hesitations to work with psychotherapists and counselors because we're all
Same.
afflicted. Yeah, we're all afflicted
Yeah.
with a host of blind spots and things we just don't see. And get another set of eyes in there, get another lens in there. Yes, theoretically, you can introspect your way, and in the Buddhist tradition, the teachings on emptiness can handle everything. But in my experience and decades of being in this business, get back to me on how that works.
Yeah.
I mean, life is short. Use all the tools that we have in the East and West. Be more open-minded.
For sure. And I'll say in my experience, I teach sort of general population meditation classes, but I also teach within an intensive outpatient substance use recovery program.
Yeah.
And in that recovery program, every participant in the class has a therapist. They also have a psychiatrist for the most part. They're doing lots of different work to support this journey that they're on. And what I notice is that those IOP classes where they're already doing therapeutic work, they're already bringing in these other layers of support, they are so willing to like get into their practice and discuss it and feel things and name things and bring things to the forefront to discuss as a group, and without any disrespect to a general population class, but more often than not, they tend to be a little bit more reserved in my experience. I really see the added value of being in the midst of therapeutic work. It adds a layer of
Oh, totally.
support.
Yeah,
Yeah.
therapeutic work, somatic work, nocturnal work. I mean, we in this age of globalization and information, there's just so many resources we can use because both the East and the West have their blind spots, like we were alluding to earlier, and by definition, we don't see what we don't see.
Yeah.
So having these other modalities to get us out of our stuck places and the detours and the cul-de-sacs, to me, that's invaluable because boy, I mean, you can waste years, decades, even an entire life tripping out on some of these things. I mean, case in point, you can have an experience of such quiescence. Let's just say this, and I've experienced this with both with myself to some extent and with professed masters, quote unquote, in the West, where they have one particular really high quality called jhana experience, a real high level of quiescence. And because the contrast is so profound from a kind of out of control, wild, speedy mind to now everything just being completely pacified, they actually confuse that pacification for liberation. The tranquility can be so profound in contrast to the previous level of upheaval and contraction that they think that's it. And then what happens is they get stuck. They really
Mm.
just set a new metric for their meditation. They get attached to it. They think that's what meditation is. And people can really get trapped here. And I witnessed it personally for over many, many decades in my life. These are very subtle, insidious traps on the meditative spiritual path.
Can you speak a little bit more to that for listeners? So you're talking about this sort of very, I'm going to call it a high level of tranquility
Yeah.
in comparison to liberation. So how would listeners understand the difference between those two?
Yeah, well, at first they may not. See, that's
Mm,
exactly the point. So
mm,
that's why pointing this out is worth noting. But let me just put it to you this way. This is such a great line, and then I'll unpack it. The great Zen master Suzuki Roshi allegedly said at the moment of his awakening, enlightenment was my biggest disappointment. That's a really interesting comment. What is he talking about? Well, for someone like Suzuki Roshi, who was already so open, the ultimate letdown into reality, the ultimate downer into your body, he was already so open that the contrast was no longer there. He slid in very gracefully into the state of what the Buddhist tradition talks about as enlightenment. And in fact, in a very real way, it was just like no big deal. And in fact, in the Tibetan tradition, the um, mind that's actually recognizes that it's literally called ordinary mind, Tamugi
mm,
Shepa.
mm,
That's the quality. So this is super important because very often on the psycho-spiritual, mostly spiritual path, people are looking for like a Hollywood type of experience. They want the clouds to part and the choruses to sing and the music to come out. Hey, I'm not dissing that. That can be a very legitimate part of it. But really, the way I put it in my languaging, here we are looking for Hollywood when the experience is more like Oklahoma. I love Oklahoma, by the way, right? I love Oklahoma. Or it's more like Kansas, right? So in other words, what we're actually looking for, it's already right here, right now. It's already so open. I mean, not so open, so ordinary. It's just right in front of you. It's hiding in plain sight. But because we have these predispositions that it's got to be this big orgasmic event or this big grand opening course opening thing, then when we have these ordinary moments of awakening, we forget about them or we don't recognize them as such. So for us, right, that one way to say it is that the ecstasy of awakening or opening is directly proportional to the preceding level of agony or contraction. So if you're really contracted and you have an experience of opening, and I promise you, as a kind of investigation for all your listeners, this is a good one. Look underneath any experience to which you would append the label spiritual. I guarantee you will find some quality of openness. This is really important because the whole meditative path for me, my favorite definition of meditation is, in fact, habituation to openness. So this is really important because if you look, oh, wow, I had this great high experience, this peak, big peak experience. Well, that's fine. But if you just realize the condition that brought about that is one of openness, and you don't understand that, well, what do? Then you grasp after that experience. You want more of it. Well, what have you done? You've just replaced the chain made of lead with one made of gold because you're still grasping. Now
mm,
you're grasping after a delicious meditative state of mind. And what do? You become a state junkie. You just want these delicious meditative states. So this is a trap that can occur at any point along the path. It also tends to occur on more elevated levels where people get really kind of stuck. Taisiti Rinpoche, great Tibetan master, said that these are the most dangerous of all spiritual traps because they're so delicious. These states of mind are so delicious. And so as I playfully say, these are like the sweets, the mental spiritual candy. Well, if you just feed on sweets, they're going to make your meditation sick. You're going to suffer from truth decay.
mm.
All right. All right. So what do you do? So here's the key, and then I'll stop. What do? Well, it's like my teacher very powerfully admonished his students, including me. You nurture your meditation by destroying it. What? What does that mean?
Mm.
Well, it means you don't destroy the meditation experience, you destroy your clingy, graspy relationship to it. And so the invitation is to reinstate the conditions that brought about the experience in the first place, which is what? Open, release, let go. And so, therefore, the good, the bad, and the ugly, all the stuff that comes up in meditation, they're called nyam in Tibetan, temporary experiences. It's all going to come up. Let it come up, let it go, just like clouds flying in the sky, no problema. The minute you start sticking to them, trying to reestablish them, you have a new metric, a new bar for success in your meditation. The minute you do that, the Islamic tradition talks about it as the golden cage. you're just trapped in a meditative state of mind. So these are important to understand. So the long-winded, circuitous response to a good question. I hope I
You
got it.
did. It's so valuable to offer this. And there's, I mean, you've named multiple times actually spiritual bypassing, spiritual materialism, and I can see how easy it is to get lost in any of these if we're not awake to what's
Um,
happening, right?
um,
Yeah.
yeah, I
It's
mean, and just
valuable
very
to be aware that this
well.
exists along the path.
This is huge. Let me just say very briefly one thing. This is a
Please.
really important topic. When the East works with meditative states, they're literally working with what are called states of consciousness. And these are really important. We're actually working to acquire familiarity and access to these states. But here's where the problem comes in. You can have a very high level state experience. And if you don't have a corresponding, gets a little geeky here for just a second, you don't have a corresponding high level of structural experience. In other words, a developmental level. This is the great contribution of the West. East is more state oriented, West is more structure oriented, developmentalism, structuralism, that kind of thing. The reason I go into this little nerdy thing is this is where all the sex abuse issues come from, the power abuse, the scandals
Mm.
that will never, ever stop in the meditative spiritual business. Because if you have a high level state experience, and unless you stay completely in silence, the minute you open your mouth, the minute you move or speak, you have no choice but to relate and interpret your experience through your structural level of development. And here's the kicker: you cannot see these things introspectively. This is why the meditative traditions don't talk about them, because they didn't have the data acquisition systems, the studies, the surveys, the so-called social methodologies to assess these things. And so therefore, you get teachers who are relatively awake. This is a path of waking up, but there's another path of growing up. They're not grown up.
Mm.
And then you get all the crap show that you see that will never, ever end as long as people, just like you said, are not aware of these two vectors of psychospiritual development. This can
Mm.
save so much heartbreak and bring a level of understanding. Otherwise, how do you explain the so-called meditative master who can
Yeah.
just be a real jerk? What's going on there? Well, it's because there are these two vectors of growth.
Wow. So valuable to think about. Thank you. Waking up and growing up.
Yeah. John Wellwood's term, by the way, he was just such a
Mm.
fantastic a psychotherapist and a very, very deep student of Buddhism.
So let's take a little pivot for a minute because I really did want to discuss with you the nocturnal meditations.
Okay.
So these come sort of towards the end of the book. You have guided us through several different insight meditation practices, reverse meditation practices. Listeners, there's a whole nother episode on reverse meditations about a year ago you can find to listen to. And then you bring in nocturnal practices. And I love working with my dreams, Andrew. So I want to hear all about
Cool.
nocturnal practices. Let's start with, why does the dream state matter? Like, why should we care
Oh,
about our dreams?
yeah, Lordy. Well, boy, there's so much here. Yeah, dreams are colossal, right? I mean,
Mm.
and this is an interesting bit of data. So there are about 4,000 world cultures, more or less. 90% of those world cultures are what are called polyphasic, which means they pay allegiance and homage to so-called altered states of consciousness. In this case, particularly the reality that's revealed in the dream arena. The 10% that are associated with Eurocentric cultures, that'd be us, these are
Mm.
monophasic cultures. These are cultures that put all their eggs in the wake centric basket. In other words, they're the ones that think the only way you can really understand mind and reality is through the waking state. This is a classic developmental issue again. So this is ego working on overdrive. Basically, what happens is ego, which is sight-centric, photocentric, light-centric, all these in the service of egocentricity. Ego basically dismisses other states of consciousness that it cannot fully actualize. And so therefore it dismisses and colonizes things like the dreaming state and even the deep dreamless state. And in so doing, it categorically throws out two-thirds of reality. And basically, this is the two-thirds that are disclosed in the dreaming arena, in the dreaming consciousness, the dreaming mind, and the deep dreamless mind. And so basically in the West, we live in a truly flatland, one-dimensional worldview, where the only way we can know reality is in the waking state. I mean, give me a break. So you're throwing away two-thirds of reality. And so the nocturnal meditations really introduce you to a truly three-dimensional view, where you can open the aperture of your awareness. That's what actually takes place with these practices. You're dilating your consciousness to bring in the light, the deeper inner light within the sleeping and dreaming arena. And so when the West says, oh, geez, it's just a dream, that's a dismissive comment. That just is revelatory of like, oh, don't worry about your dreams. That doesn't really matter. Well, according to the world wisdom traditions, the 90% of these polyphasic traditions, the West has it all bass-ackwards, that if you're actually lucid in the dream state, that's lucid dreaming, you are more in contact with reality than you are in the waking state. And to go even deeper, this is where it gets beyond profound. You are actually if you're lucid, this means if you're conscious of the fact that you're dreaming, and then believe it or not, conscious of the fact that you're in deep dreamless sleep, which for most people would go, what? I mean, what are you talking about? That's a contradiction in terms. Well, no, it's not. This is actually the truest dimension of the mind if you're lucid to it, which is why the great Advaita Vedanta Indian sage Ramana Maharshi said so compellingly, that which does not exist in deep dreamless sleep is not real. So this, what we think to be the most real, this is the bass-ackwards part, this is what you think is the most real, is actually the most illusory. This is actually the nightmare from which the Buddha, the ultimate lucid dreamer, his name literally means awakened one, that's what he woke up from, the nightmare of samsara. He woke up to a reality that includes these deeper, more foundational dimensions of being. And so this little riff really creates the view for like, well, why bother with these nocturnal meditations? And there are 5 of them, and I'll just mention them.
Please.
And you can tell me which ones you want to go into. But it's important to understand the view behind these practices, because otherwise, what does ego do? Well, it puts a big do not disturb sign on the arena of sleep and dream. And so having the right view to understand, why should I bother with these practices? Well, if you understand that you're working with more foundational dimensions of your being, that what you do down at these root levels has massive disproportional beneficial effects in the waking state, you start to realize that you're entering, my languaging, a really unique kind of night school, a learning institute of higher education, where according to some neuroscientists, there's some really compelling neuroscientific data to support the following statement, that this really could represent the pedagogy, the education of the future, because you have such amazing capabilities to transform and change in the sleep and dream state. Why? Because you're no longer working with the leaves and the twigs and the branches and even the trunk of your life. You're working with the roots. And if you work with the roots, you change everything. So that's why it's worth the effort. So I'll just ping out what the 5 are, then you can tell me which of the 5 you want to talk about. So there are 5 practices here in the nocturnal curricula. The first one's called liminal dreaming. The second one's lucid dreaming. The third one is dream yoga. Fourth one is sleep yoga. And the last one is what's called bardo yoga. So I can run with any of these depending on where you want to take it, because
I want to talk about all of them.
Right, I've read three books on the topic. Lots to say here. So just tell me what you think might be of best interest to your audience.
Why don't we do this? What I would love to do is let's talk about liminal dreaming, because I feel like we want to go to lucid dreaming right away. A lot of people have heard that term before. Let's start where you start. Let's start at liminal.
I think that's really smart. Okay, so let's do this. So liminal dreaming, the word literally means threshold, and it refers to this kind of intermediate plasma dimension of experience or mind, from when your head first hits the pillow to when you really kind of zonk out. So we all know what it's like. You're kind of there, but not really there. You're popping in and out, and all kinds of interesting, bizarre things are happening in your mind, in your experience. And for most people, I mean, they pay no attention to that whatsoever. They basically hit the sack and they crash out. Well, With liminal dreaming, you can maintain a thread of awareness, slash mindfulness. This is where your mindfulness now extends into the night. And so you can establish a mindful relationship to the contents of your mind as they go offline every night when you fall asleep. And then liminal dreaming also applies to the back end. When you wake up in the morning, you're in a liminal space when you come back online. And so there is so much you can do here that's interesting. I mean, here's just one thing. Both Thomas Edison and Salvador Dali, pretty clever creative geniuses, came up with very innovative ways to kind of troll this dimension of experience, where they would basically sit in a chair holding like a spoon or something above a plate. And then as they started to doze off, the grip would release, the spoon would fall down and it would clang, and it would wake them up. And so they would then kind of troll or farm this particular dimension. And in Dali's work, he came up with so much of his surrealistic art, which is a consequence of this kind of surrealistic dimension of experience. Edison came up a lot with his creativity. And so there's a ton of science here supporting the validity of exploring dimensions of creativity, because basically what's happening here is the conscious, the boundary between the conscious and the unconscious mind is becoming more porous and eventually breaking down. And that's where the creativity comes from the depths of the unconscious mind. And so one way to actually work with it, people go, gee, well, what do I do? I mean, okay, this is cool. Well, I mean, one way very simply is you create what's called an observational intent, which is what it sounds like. You just set the intention that I want to observe, I want to witness my mind tonight as it falls asleep. And you start to notice some incredibly interesting things. You start to notice how thoughts, you go to bed, it's thinking. If you pay attention, and that's the observational intent part, you'll start to notice that the thinking then transforms into imaging. So less thinking, more pictures, more images. That's actually called, it's a name, it's called thought image amalgamation. So there's a state where thoughts are transforming into images. Images then transform into these little micro lucid dreamlets, these little small bubbles of lucidity. That's a very legitimate, however brief it may be, form of lucid dreaming. Then with some facility, that can actually manifest into what's called awake initiated lucid dream, which is where you actually bring your lucidity slash awareness slash mindfulness from the waking state through the liminal state into the dream state. You never lose the thread of consciousness. Wow. So I'll end with one last thing, because there's so many cool things to say here. But one really interesting contribution of liminal dreaming that's almost unique in the four other practices is the ability to watch the narrative structure of ourself come undone. So in other words, who you think you are, Meryl, who I think I am, Andrew, we have this kind of sense of identity. This is who we think we really are. Well, what liminal dreaming can show to you that's so cool is that who you think you are is just a narrative. It's just a storyline. And so when you're watching the storyline come apart as you fall asleep, and by the way, if it didn't, that creates one of the 7 forms of insomnia. So that has to come undone, or you're not going to fall asleep. So as that slows down and you start to notice the chain of thoughts breaking apart, it's literally the end of what's called linking thinking, you start to realize it's the most amazing, liberating thing. You go, so wait a second, as I fall asleep, I'm actually falling apart. And who I think I am is just this storyline. You've had this experience if you're traveling internationally. You wake up with jet lag in the middle of some foreign country in the middle of the night, and there's a few moments where you don't know where you are, and you don't know who you are. There's just like this big hole in your mind. And that is a really interesting experience of the liminal space. And so armed with liminal dreaming, you can then work with that dimension. And then you can see on the other end, as you wake up, before you start to move, you can see the kind of Rolodex start to spin again, whatever metaphor you want to use. You can start to see how the quilt patchwork nature of your being gets stitched back together. And you wake up in the morning and you go, wow, I slept great. No, you didn't. It's an illusion. There is no you that fell asleep. There's no you that woke up. So this is what's so cool about this practice. It's fun, it's playful, it's relatively accessible, it's entertaining as all get out. And it's also eventually really deep because
Mm.
it can show you how the sense of self is constructed and deconstructed, not just night to night and day to day, but moment to moment. So I'll pause because, boy, we even with this one practice alone,
I
there's so
know.
much to say. So it's
We
pretty cool.
might have to do another episode because I
Okay.
am so interested in all of this. And my the experience that comes to mind for me when I think about liminal dreaming is I often find if I nap during the day, I
Perfect.
almost always end up in this limit. Like I don't drop. I think maybe I do. I don't know. I don't know that I drop into like deep dreamless sleep, right?
Uh-huh.
But what I experience when I nap during the day is that I will feel asleep and I will feel what feels like a little pocket of my brain go, this is so interesting. I'm totally aware of what's happening around me, but I know I'm asleep. And it's almost like, uh, not in a literal way, but almost like I'm able to just sort of like walk around in my mind while I'm asleep. And it's such
Well,
an interesting experience. And then, so then the question is begged, like, well, then what happens when I go to bed at night? Like, is it the same? Is it different? Can I do the same thing? So I agree with you completely. I think it's so fun to bring
yeah.
this to
It's
nighttime. Like, what a cool thing to get to explore.
yeah, it's really interesting. And just like briefly, like you said, the scientists these days, I roll a lot in the neuroscientific community, and the refinements in data in the neuroimaging these days actually show that part of your brain, can actually be awake while the other part of your brain is asleep.
Oh, that's interesting.
I'll pause any political jokes that could be brought about there, but the idea is that you can actually have part of your witnessing mind that is awake, just like you're saying. That's the witness awareness,
Yeah.
literally watching another part of your brain that's actually asleep. And prior to this exploration, there was just no sensitivity at all to these really interesting dimensions of our being. And so as you slow down, as you start to open up, as you start to develop heightened levels of mindfulness and awareness, again, these practices are nocturnal Vipashyana or insight meditations.
Mm.
You start to see things you've never seen before. And these are game changer or life changer types of events. They really help you see the power of the creative mind, how we're not victims of our reality, we're victims of our narratives, we're victims of our own constructs. So the implications here, they're not only entertaining, they're liberating. They go very, very deep. You can use the nocturnal arena, even in a more effective way because it's more concentrated, to really penetrate the nature of the self, the sense of self, and why we suffer. So they go pretty far.
And listeners, I just want to name, we didn't even cover 2 sentences from that chapter on nocturnal meditation. So there's a lot of detail about the practices themselves, ways to enter into those practices. So if you are interested in going deeper in this, please do pick up the book because you'll get much more context than we can do in our short time together.
True.
Andrew, I want to ask one more thing before we
Okay.
practice. As you named, as we move through this sort of tapestry of contemplative practice and we move through nocturnal practices, we're really invited into this deeper place. And you bring us to an invitation to reflect on one mind. And I love what you said at the end of the book about the practice as more than just simply me on a cushion feeling better about myself. It's so much broader than that. And I'd love
Mm,
to maybe have just a brief discussion on one mind and relationship to others and the
yeah.
planet, our place in
That's
it.
nice. Yeah, that's a nice way to kind of come around and close. Well, it's actually connected to where the nocturnal meditations also take you, because these practices, again, they're different ways to explore the dimensions of our being using different states of consciousness. But using the nocturnal journey that we have just started, in the languaging there, in the deepest way, we really do all share the same bed of mind. All the world's wisdom traditions proclaim this. Many of the non-dual philosophical traditions, East and West, proclaim this. This is absolutely nothing new. This has been around for thousands of years. We all literally come from this fundamental unity. And just very briefly, even the principles of quantum entanglement, where the Nobel Prize was given in physics 2 years ago, really strongly suggests this at a physical level. And so
Mm.
as we fall into these really deep states of mind, like Rumi said, falling into wider rings of being. So when you engage in really deep meditation, when you engage in these nocturnal meditations, which are a form of meditation, you're opening, you're pulling away, literally withdrawing, retreating from this individualized, localized self sense, which is just the daily construct that we almost mutually exclusively identify with. That completely falls apart in meditation, falls apart in nocturnal practices. And it's the farther down you go, as they say, there's some dream researchers that have really interesting languaging here. The farther down the rabbit hole you go, the more collective the experience becomes. Carl Jung talked about this as the collective unconsciousness. We're talking now about the collective superconsciousness. And so we all share the same fundamental mind. It's not my mind, it's not your mind, it's what's called the mind at large, the universal infinite field of subjectivity. I guess you could call it God if that speaks to you. You can call it Buddhahood if that speaks to you. It doesn't really matter. But here's the analogy I give. So this is a little exercise we can do together. Okay, so go ahead and close your left eye and just look around through your right eye for just 15 seconds. Right? You have a particular view of the world through this right eye, right? All right, now go ahead and close your right eye. Open your left eye. Okay, you have a particular view from this eye, right? Pretty darn similar to the other eye, but not exactly the same. So behind these two eyes, you have within you your one mind. Now, take this principle and realize that there are 16, these are just human eyes. Now, we're not even talking about the animal kingdom. There are 16 billion sets of eyes that behind it have the same underlying mind. So in exactly the same way that we actually look at the world through two slightly different perspectives, well, there are 16 billion different perspectives, and underneath all those is the same unified principle of underlying humanity in mind. So you don't think that's going to change you if you don't understand this? So this is a marvelous way to bring these practices into fruition, because realizing this changes everything. This is where empathy is born. This is where genuine compassion is born. This is where service to the planet and to others is born. It comes naturally. It's like Ramana Maharshi again said so beautifully when he was once asked, how do we best help others? His reply, what others? There are no others. We're just helping ourselves. We just forgot. Every morning when we wake up, we forget that we arise from the same bed of mind. Essence of spiritual practice is remembrance. So as we remember this, we realize we're all one. We share the same commonality. In fact, we share, we are like nature, right? I mean, we're not products of nature. We are nature. And so if we live that, then we act as natural expressions and stewards of nature itself. And so for me, this is a great way, because every time I finish a program or a riff these days, I have this little rant.
Okay.
if what we're doing in this conversation, if what I'm doing with my books is not of benefit to others and to the planet, it's irrelevant. It's just new age feel good strategies. And again, I love the new age. Don't let me just categorically dismiss that, but I think you get the point. Why are we doing this? We're doing this for the service of others. And if we do that, then you've come to some fruition with these practices, because you've fallen down, the mind falls into itself. In these deep meditations, we realize we all share this commonality of mind and heart. That's a total game changer. It's one way to talk about what awakening really is.
Hear, hear. Thank you, Andrew. What an awesome conversation.
Well, it's fun.
I
I
could
love your
go
questions.
forever. Thank you. I wonder if you feel good guiding just a short little
Sure.
something for us to share practice together.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do it.
Please.
So yeah, I'll guide you through a little practice that will bring together several of the things that we've talked about.
Oh, great.
Maybe one or two things that I've hinted at that I haven't fully explored, and maybe it'll be of some value. This is literally something I do every single day before I start my formal prayers and liturgies and whatnot. I start every day with this very simple practice. So I'm going to invite you to put your hand over your heart and close your eyes. And then the practice is to simply look in, feel in, and just what's it like today? What's I'm like looking out to see what the weather is like, but you're looking in, feeling in, what's it like today? And whatever it is, and see here, it does not matter. Whatever it is that you're feeling, the practice is to feel it fully. Feel it, but don't feed it. You know you're feeding it when you start to run commentary, you start to judge it. Swami Kripalu said beautifully, highest form of spiritual practice is self-observation without judgment. Putting your hand over your heart represents a quality of loving kindness towards yourself and radical acceptance. This is the practice of metta or maitri that we didn't officially talk about in our conversation, but it's in the book. The practice of loving kindness towards oneself, holding the contents of your experience with unconditional acceptance and love. Because we express towards others what we express towards ourselves. The invitation to feel so deeply is a very subtle, it's not overt, but it's a covert invitation for Vipashyana, insight, which also means in feeling, getting in touch with who and what you really are. It develops a beautiful quality of equanimity. It's radical acceptance, saying yes to whatever arises. It's a journey of waking down, using again the wisdom of your body. If you're having a particularly challenging experience one morning and you're feeling something to which you would append the label difficult, challenging, or crappy, stay with that. Be with that. And a little bit like what we talked about last year with the reverse meditations, you can reverse your normal strategy to unwanted experience with this practice by simply staying with it. That starts to transform it. Eventually, you can look through, feel through, see through all the constructs that you would throw on, add to a particular type of feeling or experience, and deconstruct that back to its pure energetic essence, and just stay with that. It's a wonderful, very simple gesture every morning to say yes to who you are, to develop a quality of tenderness, loving kindness towards yourself, which then eventually matures into compassion. And then what I do, I put my hand on my side. And I would open my eyes, and I can't do it because I'm strapped to this microphone. But then when I end my sessions, I don't just close and step out. I always stand up for a minute. I include a standing meditation for 30 seconds. And then after that 30 seconds, I do a very brief, very short little walking meditation. So this is like what we talked about 45 minutes ago, a way to extend my meditation away from just one posture, one particular way of doing it, literally into the other postures, the asanas, mudras that constitute my life. And therefore, it's an invitation, like we said a little while ago, to enter a lifetime retreat in the course of normal life.
Beautiful. Thank you, Andrew. Such a pleasure to get to chat with you today. Thank you.
Yeah, so appreciate it. Thanks for taking the time, and as usual, the sensitive, intelligent questions. It's a delight. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to Our Mindful Nature. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider sharing it with a friend or leaving me a review wherever you get your podcasts. It helps others to find the show, and let's face it, we could all use a few more meditators in our lives. Our Mindful Nature is recorded on Muskogee land and produced with the support of Brianna Nielsen. Deep gratitude is offered to acoustic ecologists Gordon Hempton and Nick McMahon for the use of their nature field recordings in many of these episodes. To join my live classes, ask questions, or learn about my teacher trainings, please visit merylarnett.com. Thanks again for listening. I'll see you next week.